Conscient Podcast, episode 198. Climate activist and social innovator, Tim Brodhead.
If we're going to see change happen, it's going to be because people change. And that doesn't occur when you preach at them or you evangelize or anything else. It comes because people, in whatever way is appropriate for them as individuals, begin to reevaluate the way they live, the way their friends live, and make different choices. And say to the government, more has to be done, because what we're losing and what the next generation, our children and grandchildren, will lose is immeasurable. And we have to act now. Later is too late.
In this episode, former CEO, climate activist, and social innovator, Tim Brodhead, takes us on a reflective journey through his extensive experience in philanthropy and international development. He shares his evolving perspectives, from initially believing in the capacity of developed countries to aid undeveloped nations, to recognizing the often exploitative dynamics at play between wealthy and poorer countries. This shift has led him to focus on the importance of educating Canadians about the unsustainability of their lifestyles and the need for mutual enlightenment over traditional aid approaches. So when I arrived at Tim's home in Metcalfe, Ontario, just south of Ottawa, I was greeted by a warm, gentle smile and the sweet sound of an antique grandmother clock, which is a bit smaller than a grandfather clock, whose ticking and bells became a leitmotif throughout our conversation. Tim Brodhead is as accomplished as he is humble. He was president and chief executive officer of the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation from 1995 to 2011. And from 2013 to 2014, he served as interim president and chief executive officer of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation. Prior to joining McConnell, Tim spent 25 years working in international development, mainly in West Africa, South Sudan, India, and Bangladesh. He was the founding executive director of ACORD, based in London, UK, and in 1975, he co-founded the Canadian development agency interim, which is based here in Ottawa, just down the street from my home. Now, before our conversation, Tim sent me an interesting email with some initial responses to my questions about the end of the world as we know it and how to create conditions for new worlds to emerge. I'll read it to you because it gives good context on Tim's perspective on that question about the end of the world as we know it. He started with a historical perspective. Over the stretch of a millennium, a relatively small community in northeastern Europe embarked on some pretty big social experiments, enclosing common lands and the emergence of private ownership as the prime creator of wealth, a splitting of spiritual and material worlds, the cogito ergo sum. The conception of private property backed up by state power as the source of personal security, the patriarchal and hierarchical nature of authority, the faith in science and technology as the main drivers of progress, etc. The experiment unfolded brilliantly for several centuries, and material well-being grew by leaps and bounds, along with wars of dispossession, despoiling of the natural environment, yawning inequality in all the markers of human well-being, etc. So that's the first part, and the second part of his email, I'll read to you, talks about some of the failings of modernity. But then it emerges that the experiments are failing. The costs outweigh the benefits. The fruits are too unequally divided. The ecosystem is pushed beyond its capacity to assure the essentials of life. The civilization that embodies these experiments begins to undergo a catastrophic failure. This has happened before. Civilizations rise and fall. The problem this time is that the process of colonization has produced a global monoculture. The values, beliefs, and institutions that emerged in northeastern Europe have spread all over the globe. They are called modernity and progress, and those who don't yet have them aspire to acquire them as fast as possible. The alternative beliefs and understandings, the famous other ways of seeing, knowing, and being, have been stamped out or suppressed. Yes, islands of resistance remain, mostly in indigenous communities, but they have the status of folklore. And to conclude my reading of Tim's pre-interview email, he talks about some of the sources of our problems. The world as we know it may be ending, but it has some pretty fierce defenders, all those whose wealth and privilege are at risk, plus those who cannot conceive of alternatives, and those who firmly believe that technology still has the power to solve our problems. The media, knowledge and education systems, cultural industries, commercial and advertising are all controlled by those with wealth and power, and they all reinforce the fundamental message: this is the way the world works. If you can't see that, you are the problem. I agree with Tim. So what do you suggest we do, Tim?
We need to rethink and reform and invest in new approaches. And we're by and large unwilling to do it. So the need for social innovation is as strong now as it has ever been. But the facile use of language, like everyone a change maker, just ignores the fact that this is really hard work.
All right, let's get to work. It's really a question of time at this point, isn't it? Time. Tick, tock, tick, tock. But wait, this podcast is about art, isn't it? We did talk about that. Is it a saving grace, or is it a voice of consolation? And just a warning, listeners, that near the end of the recording you'll hear quite a long silence, around 10:57 a.m. as we listen for the 11 o'clock ringing, the grandmother clock. So, to situate our conversation, it's July 16th, 2024, 10:17 a.m., and we're in Tim Brodhead's dining room. Tick, tock, tick, tock. So we're in your house, Tim Brodhead, in Metcalfe, Ontario. Welcome to Conscient.
Thank you.
So I want to start with the clock because I'm fascinated by the sound, and in about 13 minutes we'll hear the 10:30 a.m. and hopefully we'll get to 11 because I really want to hear that. But maybe we'll end there because that'll be about 45 minutes. I wanted to talk to you for a number of reasons. We've known each other over the years. You worked at McConnell Foundation, and we talk about life. We just spent an hour chatting about all kinds of things. And I know you're not an expert in art, but everybody has art in their lives, and I'm interested in your thoughts on the theme of this year, of this season, which is the end of the world as we know it, and you've written to me a bit about it. So why don't we start there? I know it's a broad topic, but maybe it's just a quick intro of who you are, and then some of the thoughts that you came up with in the questions that I sent you.
Right. Well, brief intro. I, as you said, spent many years working in the world of philanthropy in a foundation in Montreal. Prior to that, I spent probably 25 years working in international development. Kind of a quaint phrase nowadays. We don't really talk much about international development. But when I graduated from university, it was a concern that people had. There was now looking back, a perhaps naive notion that the world was divided between developed countries where people lived relatively prosperous lives with opportunities and choices, and poor countries, undeveloped countries, third world countries. All kinds of phrases were used to describe all those places in the world where there was less opportunity and where people's choices were very constrained. And, we felt the sense of obligation that we could help accelerate the process by which these people would have what we had and took for granted. Of course, looking back, it was an enormously naive time. And in some ways, I think those of us who came back from that experience of living in other cultures had a generally common sense that the process of change wasn't so much what we took to other places as what we experienced ourselves. And the change was, of course, because we had the opportunity to look at our own culture from outside. And we came back much more critical of how we lived in North America, how people lived in North America, much more critical of the relationship between the so-called rich countries and poor countries, and how exploitative that was, and the overriding imperative, not so much of bringing development to what we now call the South, as bringing enlightenment of a sort, I guess, a more educated view of the realities of the world to people living in places like Canada. And so we had this burning zeal that we were going to educate Canadians, which again is pretty arrogant when you look back on it, but it was I think for all of us, a very fundamental shift in the space of a short period of time from we're going to help other people to no, we have to enlist other people in helping us to see that our world in many ways is unsustainable. We didn't use that language then, but that's what we came back. We saw, I think it was a pretty common experience. We saw the overconsumption and waste compared to what we had lived in countries where people simply didn't have that option. They used everything. They lived a way of life that was much more bound by limitations of the natural environment and the resources available and so on. What we were not aware of, I think, or speaking for myself, what I was not aware of was that we were giving people a choice of a different way of living, a different way of seeing our possibilities in the world based on the notion of progress and development. But we were not aware that, like all choices, there were trade-offs. And that while what we were offering, what we were showing people a glimpse of, wealth and opportunity, came with a price. And now looking back on it, I think that's really where one can be critical of the role that people like myself played. Unwittingly, we weren't going out to proselytize, but that's what we were doing just by who we were and how we lived, and our assumptions. And what we were not explaining or articulating to others because we didn't know it ourselves was with this choice of trying to emulate the lifestyle of people in industrialized countries, there's a heavy price tag attached. And that price tag is your sense of identity, your sense of community, your sense of ability to live within the resources and constraints of your environment. And it's a valid choice that people have to make. And what we've understood is that it's not a binary choice, but what people are giving up without realizing that they're losing it is a lot. And it's taken a lifetime for people to realize that so many of the pathologies of our way of life can be traced back to what we've lost in terms of our sense of solidarity and community and identity in the rush and glitter of the world that we have created.
Lost by erasure, which is partially what happened in certain colonial situations where threatening voices, indigenous voices, local voices were extinguished or transformed, and also a type of cultural colonization, but as you say, not intended that way, but by default. And one hopes that it would be sort of reciprocal at a certain point, right? That
I think we're getting to that point of reciprocity now. We're calling it reconciliation, but what it is learning for the first time the values of the way other people have chosen to live, the values that guide their choices and lives, and it it's reflected in so many of the things that we now associate with the values of indigenous cultures. That sense of continuity, that sense of connectedness, the sense of living within and with a sense of respect for the natural environment. Those are things that we largely have lost in our culture, but we're beginning to realize we need them, and where we find them is often in indigenous value systems. The irony, of course, is that we has spent so much time and effort trying to stamp those out that now they only survive in relatively small pockets, and it's a struggle for us to figure out within the concept of reconciliation, which I think is a misnomer. How do we respectfully reintegrate some of those values into our lives and our understanding of the world without simply appropriating or stealing them or misrepresenting them or caricaturing what they are, or imposing an additional burden on Indigenous people by saying, first we tried to stamp out your culture, and now we want to take from it, we want to pick and choose from it those aspects which we think might, again, help us
continue our own. Well, I did an interview with an Australian Indigenous scholar recently who offered up his views on the difference between primal cultures, and that primal is used in a respectful way, and modernity. So I'll point people to that episode because there's a
Right.
lot of wisdom there from just reflection on the differences and a bit of judgment, but more historical fact. This is the way things unfolded. And when you first responded to my questions in written form, you were not very optimistic about the fate of the world. But could you explain a bit how you see the world today and how we got here? You've already alluded to it with the international development sort of story. But how did we get here, Tim?
Well, I think it's useful to read some of the recent scholarship around anthropology, sociology, the recognition that what we have for a long time understood to be the way in which humanity developed has been such a partial and distorted story, because it's predicated on the notion that Europeans became somehow more highly developed through the use of science and technology and rational thinking and so on, and a whole set of ideological beliefs about the role of humans in the world and so on. And basically this was it was a worldview which was bound to dominate because it was progressive and modern and opened up all kinds of opportunities for the use of technology to advance human society and so on. And what it was replacing had very little value. It was stagnant. It was based on superstition and beliefs that had no real roots in scientific knowledge. And so this was a wonderful story of progress. And what a lot of the new historians are revealing is that this is completely wrong. That in fact, there were a lot of societies that in many ways were perhaps more successful in terms of meeting human needs, all human needs, not just physical and material needs, than the one that developed in Western Europe. And those were eradicated because the power of Western technology was such that they had no defense. And also because the spread of people from Western Europe took with them diseases and so on, which basically eradicated whole societies, or at least made them unviable. It's only a story of the success of one particular way of imagining how humans could exist in the world. And in the process, through colonization, it basically created a monoculture that eradicated so many of the alternatives, including other ways of organizing human life, which in some respects were more positive, more affirming than the one that we grew up with, the one that we have embraced as being indicative of modernity. So it's the story of a triumph of one strain. It's like so many things. It's a monoculture, and that one strain has its vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and needs to be reinforced by bringing in other ways of thinking and doing. But we'd been successful in eradicating so many of those that now we're desperate for looking for alternatives. And the edifice of modernity which we've built is very hard to dismantle. It's a complete worldview. So we recognize now some of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities. For example, people talk now about the epidemic of loneliness, the lack of
10:30. Speaking of loneliness, this is a nice companion in your house.
It is. Reminds me that time is passing. The epidemic of loneliness, or the kind of spiritual vacuum that many people experience, and their efforts to fill it with some often ersatz substitute. So it's we're reaping what we've sown. That's, I guess.
Yeah, and we are, whomever you identify as a settler or as an immigrant, or we have all these mixed identities, or some people do anyway. Yeah, so that's a good start. And then there's the whole McConnell years where you work in social innovation, and we could talk a lot about that. But I'm interested in your thoughts around art because of the mandate of the podcast, and I see some beautiful art here in your home. So in broad strokes, what is your relationship with art, or how have you used it related to it in your work, in your life?
Yeah, and it's only a very partial relationship because, I would say probably as a critique that I'm too intellectual, too much in my own head. And so what appeals to me in art is a limited range. I'm very drawn to the visual arts, much less to music or dance or more embodied forms of art, and to literature, to novels and nonfiction. And for me, these are absolutely. I can read endlessly. I have the mind of a magpie. Everything. I'm curious about everything. Which also, of course, brings with it the danger that you're actually very superficial. And as far as visual art is concerned, I just find that enormously satisfying, fulfilling. It to me, it's just absolutely critical that you be surrounded by pieces of art that tell you something or which evoke some sense, some feeling in you.
And I think about the challenges you mentioned earlier with the Western world's issues, and I think about the role of art, but I trip up again on myself because art is part of that Western world, at least here in Canada. There's obviously different traditions, but the dominant tradition, the Western tradition, is sort of embedded in this modern project and has trouble extracting itself. Like it's hard because we have a really good public funding system, we have really good systems, infrastructure, but it's all entangled. And to untangle it is hard because the artist thinks of themselves as, a voice normally of reason or of insight. But I'm realizing now that art's not going to save the world, Tim, I'm afraid. But it can help in many ways, and it has and will continue to do so, sometimes didactically, sometimes more aesthetically and all that. We'll come back to art, but I know that you're involved in a number of projects, and one of them is the Climate Legacy Organization. And I'm interested in that because I'm getting older, believe it or not. I'm going to be a senior citizen in December. And I'm noticing some really good energy. There's a big event on October 1st here in Ottawa, and there's and rightfully so, that those who have benefited from this period of prosperity, the people of your and my generation, have to give back. But how do they do that? So what is, as an example, the Climate Legacy Project, but older people, how can they or must they contribute to fixing some of the issues that they're not responsible for them directly, personally, but they have been part of an era?
And that was the impetus behind launching Climate Legacy. It was the sense that, it's all very well for Greta Thunberg and her generation to mobilize, but we, the generation of 60, 70, 80-year-olds, we're the ones who have benefited from a whole lifetime of relatively cheap energy and a largely exploitative attitude towards resources. And it's incumbent on us to do our part, to recognize that we have a responsibility. And I think we also have a responsibility because we grew up knowing something different, not worrying about species loss or loss of biodiversity or the high cost of energy and what have you. So we knew that other world, and we know that that's not a world that our children are going to know or grandchildren. So it really puts a responsibility, I think, on us, and it's one which has not yet really seized our generation. By and large, I mean, I think there's a sense of concern, but it's not top of mind. That's clear from polling and so on, that most people are more concerned about cost of living issues and availability of things and jobs and all that stuff, all of which are important. But the existential threat is coming from what we're doing to our natural world. And so a group of us who were all of an age, but who'd been active throughout our working lives in a whole range of social and other issues, felt, we can't complain about the lack of action on the part of citizens or the government or corporations and so on, unless we're prepared to do something ourselves. And that something had to be partly through behavioral change, a recognition that many of our practices are negative in terms of their impact on the environment. But also it requires changes in the regulatory environment, the policy environment, what government is forcing us to do, because systemic change is not going to come about because individuals recycle more or consume more intelligently. It's going to come about because the system itself, the whole way in which incentives are offered or things are costed, changes. And that requires that we pressure government, because government won't do it by itself. And the evidence already exists in Canada that, by and large, the public is more concerned and more anxious for action on climate than the government is prepared to take. And that's, of course, because there are forces arrayed against change that are very powerful. And so essentially we came together and said, well, what do we do? And our focus was really on ourselves, or our generation, people like ourselves. We were not going to preach to others, and it was clear that that isn't effective anyway. I mean, we know a lot of information now about the impact we're having in exacerbating problems. It hasn't changed. It hasn't forced a change in our behavior or in the policies which determine what happens.
Pension funds, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. If we're going to see change happen, it's going to be because people change. And that doesn't occur when you preach at them or you evangelize or anything else. It comes because people, in whatever way is appropriate for them as individuals, begin to reevaluate the way they live, the way their friends live, and make different choices. And say to the government, more has to be done, because what we're losing and what the next generation, our children and grandchildren, will lose is immeasurable. And we have to act now. This later is too late. Mm-hmm. So climate legacy essentially is trying to identify, what are the ways in which you have that conversation with people. And it is a conversation. It's not a speech, and it's not a lecture, and it's not a sermon. It's a conversation. Now, of course, the pandemic and all that followed made that conversation hard to have, because it's not a conversation over Zoom. It's a person-to-person conversation with people you trust, people in your family, people in your community, where you talk about these things from a sense of, this is what it means for me. What does it mean for you? And is there anything we can do to change the trajectory we're on? And that's really what climate legacy is doing in a variety of ways. Part of it is about organizing seniors, because there's strength in numbers. People feel less isolated if they see what their neighbors are doing. Part of it is encouraging intergenerational conversations. What are they saying to their grandchildren? What are their grandchildren asking them about? How did you live when you were my age? What were the things you loved about being outside? Will those exist for me? And unfortunately, the answer in many ways is going to be no, probably not, unless we do something, unless we change our values, the way we live. And to go back to our notion about other cultures, this is, people talk about the indigenous worldview of looking 7 generations in the past and 7 generations in the future when you're making important decisions. That's not something Western culture is about. We talk about now.
Yeah, and the electoral cycle of 2 or 3 years maximum.
And of course, Silicon Valley mantra of move fast and break things. I mean, it's antithetical to the way that more traditional societies operate. They don't move fast and break things. Maybe they move too slowly, but they're always concerned about, what is the cost? What is the downside? What are we losing or potentially losing? And so, you need a balance. I mean, there's much in having a what we think of as a modern worldview, looking ahead, always looking for opportunities. There's much in that that's valuable, but there's a price. And I think too often we are oblivious of what that price is and who has to pay it. I mean, often we're oblivious because we're not the ones who are paying that price.
Right, and we don't want to know, because if we knew, we might stop the behavior, quite, because we are sensitive beings. We don't intentionally want to hurt others, but if we ignore it, it's easier to do.
Definitely. Yeah.
I wanted to bring in a bit of art in this, because I don't know if you've ever been to a Raging Grannies performance.
No, but I heard about it.
My now passed away mother-in-law, Esther Matthews, was one of those. And I thought it was so powerful, right? Because who's going to take a bunch of grannies? And so they would go on to, Parliament Hill or a corporation and sing songs, with the known songs, but with lyrics that are very political and very, very timely and challenging. And so there's this sense that the politician or the person in power has a mother and has a grandmother, and kind of likes songs, and then has a different way into the issue. So as opposed to lobbying in the conventional sense, which has merit, song and dance and counterculture and all of these small but powerful things, because they touch another part of our being.
And it's important who is doing it. I mean, I find it fascinating that in so many different places, the radical leadership is coming from women, often older women. You know, when you think of the women of the Cinque de Mayo movement in Argentina, or the women in South Africa who basically kept their communities intact through the AIDS crisis, or the women who in Switzerland have just brought a successful case before the Human Rights Court in Europe around environmental protection. It's older women who are kind of the protectors, in a sense, in many cultures, the protectors of the natural world, and also the leaders and guides to the human world, who are playing this role, which in our culture is really countercultural. We don't expect that kind of leadership to come from older people, and especially women. And yet it's powerful.
Well, the Raging Grannies example is one that I've experienced, but I've also noticed in the Climate Legacy newsletter that there's often poetry, there's the integration of arts and culture, because it's a cultural movement, it's a cultural shift that's required, right? And we're not talking about recycling as a technical activity. We're talking about engaging with the environment and relating, and you know, the wisdom of older people, it's a two-edged sword, right? Because some of them are quite set in their ways and aren't so wise in what needs to happen. But others have maybe always had that consciousness, but now more than ever want to share. And they don't necessarily need to be listened to the way that maybe when they were younger, but to participate and to play a role, especially where they have some agency, right? I think about the financial piece, which is really powerful, because you know, I have a pension. Most people who are retired have some kind of savings, but where is that savings being invested? And it seems so basic to do that, but it's something that needs to be done to shift the money to better places, better investments, you know, both financially and ultimately culturally, the kinds of activities. So I don't need to convince you of that, but I think
it is one of the assets of older people. We basically, not only do we have assets,
such as old grandmother clocks.
Speaking of grandmothers, yes. We have assets that we don't even recognize that we have often. A pension.
There's your phone.
A pension seems like an abstract thing that we have no control over, but in fact we do. It's our money, and we've encouraged people to ask their pension fund manager, how is this money being used? Where are you investing it? Is it being used in positive, life-affirming ways, or is it going into just the chase for the highest possible return, regardless of what the impact might be on the environment or on society? And the other asset people have, of course, as they get older, is that they vote, and they can use that electoral power to bring about changes. In fact, it's critical that they do. But, you know, I think so much of the early discussion around climate issues appeal to reason. You know, this is the evidence. The world is getting hotter. The planet is warming, and it's going to have these negative impacts. It hasn't worked. We know now what's happening as a result of our behavior around biodiversity, for example, or other practices. It hasn't changed the behavior. The incentives for keeping things in place are very, very strong. So using art as a way to somehow get around the defenses of our rational systems of how we approach a problem is much more effective. It's really appealing to people in other dimensions of their being than the purely rational. because we're not going to get people to change simply by appealing to reason.
More art, but also more creativity, imagination. I want to talk a bit about social innovation because I've been part of a what's it called, transition group, innovation transition group. The one that I did an episode on art and defeatism with that group. Transition innovation group is called. How does social innovation, because you've worked many years in that, and there's lots of theoretical models there, but how does it fit into this? Because it's coming out of the capitalist system in a way, because a lot of the philanthropy comes from the capitalist system. So I know there's some tensions in there, but how does social innovation fit into this? Is it still a force?
Like so many things, it's hard to remember that social innovation, the concept, the term, didn't exist 15 years ago. And one of the things that people remarked upon was how in a culture, and particularly an economy, which absolutely relies on constant innovation, constant production of new ways of doing things, new products, new processes, and so on. On the social side, how we organized ourselves, how we dealt with social issues, there was very little room for innovation. It was, in fact, all the incentives were not to innovate. Keep doing the same thing even where the evidence is that it's not working, because it's less risky. You're not going to be criticized if you're doing what people have always done, even if you don't get the desired results. Whereas you try something and it blows up in your face, you'll pay a price. And in the social sector, the price was you won't get funding in the future. You'll be identified as a failure. So trying to turn that around and say, no, in the same way that in business, a company that wasn't investing in R&D probably will find itself in decline or bankrupt relatively quickly. Why is it that we accept that that's the way the world operates in terms of our economic world, but in the social world, we can't take risks, we can't try new things, we can't be critical about how successful approaches have been just because they've been around for a long time. And so the social innovation, that whole effort was to encourage people to try different things in the same way that we do in other parts of our lives. It's become, over time, like so many things, it's become a bit of a buzzword and a bit overused and emptied of meaning. Social innovation now is anything that people choose to call social innovation. The term change maker and the mantra, everyone can be a change maker, frankly, is just language. It means nothing. It's not true that everyone's a change maker. It's not true that we all want change. Many of us do not want change, and we demonstrate that all the time in our political choices and in the way we live. Change can be frightening. It can be risky, and we want stability. Also, we want security. We want to avoid risk in our daily lives. So the concepts of change maker and more recently the emphasis on systemic change. I mean, the only change that matters is systemic change. Well, I mean, again, this is just, it's abuse of vocabulary. Systemic change, in fact, is extremely difficult to do. Our systems work because that's the way we've designed them. They're very resilient. And when we talk about systemic change, by and large, we don't know what the hell we're talking about because we don't understand the complexity of the systems we work within. And we don't recognize the extent to which when we talk about building resilience, we're talking about helping systems avoid change, resist change. So a lot of this language, I think, is just overused and emptied of real meaning. But the basic notion that in looking at the social problems we face, we have to be open to trying different things, different approaches. I mean, if you take something as widely recognized now as the abuse of addictive drugs and so on, we've tried a number of different approaches. There is still, a very strong push back to approaches that we know have failed. It's the same thing with our penal system. We know it doesn't do what we want it to do. It doesn't reform people or reduce recidivism because it's based on punishment, and punishment is not actually a great disincentive for future criminal activity. But we persist. We build more prisons. We put more people in jail. We make prison sentences longer. We don't invest in rehabilitation. We don't look at circles of redistributive justice and so on. There are other ways of trying to resolve the problem of behavior which needs to be corrected or overcome. That's characteristic of so much of our, you can look at that in terms of our healthcare system, in terms of our education system. Yes, we need to rethink and reform and invest in new approaches. And we're by and large unwilling to do it. So the need for social innovation is as strong now as it has ever been. But the facile use of language, like everyone a change maker, just ignores the fact that this is really hard work and expensive work.
And sometimes biting the hand that feeds you. There's those tensions I talked about, which have been discussed a lot. And I'm happy to see are more upfront now. We're foundations and philanthropy is saying, well, we know where we're coming from, and we're trying to work within the system, change the system. But you're right, it's a bit facile sometimes to throw these terms around. But when we're grounded and we actually see the impact in people's lives, like the McConnell Foundation has done a lot of good work over the years because it took risks and it learned from mistakes, and it was out there being a player with old money, right? And so as the systems change, I've been listening to a podcast called the Great Simplification, a guy named Nate Higgins, and I was really impressed by his saying simply that we need to simplify our lives. We have become too complex in a bad way. I mean, complexity can be good, but so there's lots of voices out there saying, we can do this. We can slow down. We can keep some of the good sides of modernity as long as we are aware of the cost, which you referred to. It doesn't look good right now, what's happening in the U.S. and other parts of the world, but humanity has so much capacity. And I see it when I talk to people who are imaginative. They're not just fabulating of a better world. They're creating it through permaculture and other types of very concrete activities, local, many of them, sometimes global. So we're going to end soon. Now, what time is it? Oh dear, it's going to be soon in 5 minutes. I'm so looking forward because there's this beautiful listeners. You're going to have a nice audio experience because at 11 you'll hear this 11 chime. So why don't you talk to me about the clock before it rings? Like what is it?
This is a very old clock. I think it was made in Germany in the late 19th century. And has been in the family for a long time. I inherited it, and I'll pass it on to another generation. It's a grandmother clock, which means it's not as large as a grandfather clock. It has a Westminster chime, as you've heard, and it's a kind of reassuring background that reminds you that life is passing, but there's also a steadiness there. Not everything is changing. So it's something that I just have become so accustomed to as part of my environment. I've always had it.
Well, metaphorically, if you think of the winding up of the clock, which lasts a few days, like a week or something, you could think of that as a lifetime. You could think of the beating as a heart, and then eventually it slows down and it stops, right? Death. And yet you can wind it up again and have a second chance.
Unfortunately, we don't get wound up ourselves again.
We do and we don't. It depends on your beliefs.
Well, yes, that's right.
Second life or where the energy goes. There's all kinds of speculations about what happens after death. But as we wait for the 11 o'clock, and it's sort of foreboding, this 11 o'clock thing. It's like the 11th hour.
That's right.
But in a way, that's where we're at, right? And
we're beyond the 11th hour,
right.
I think.
Well, after the clock, I'll ask you about what you're reading these days, because that's something that I'm always curious. I know you read a lot. I see some books around the house here. Also listening to, because that tends to help me understand what you value in your mind these days. A lot of people are reading fiction, but I was interested. A colleague, Sarah Garton Stanley, who's in the arts world, was saying, "I love pundits." And I do too. I love political discourse. I love podcasts that are like this, sort of fluid conversations, and somehow they have a poetry to them because people are speaking quite authentically. They're not scripted. They're just engaging. There's a bit of energy exchange and then emotion because you agree or disagree and that kind of thing. So, but we'll just wait for the 11 o'clock because I don't mind waiting in silence because there's a little tick that happens before it goes on.
That's right.
Which I guess is just the mechanism saying, I'm about to do the... So let's just listen and wait for the 11 o'clock. That was nice, especially with the bird song in the background. There was somebody doing chainsaw, very, very distant. Yes. That's sort of a soundscape moment. These microphones won't capture everything, but how did that feel to you? It's sort of like you're used to it, but for me, it's like an enchanted forest. To have this old wood and this refined craftsmanship of precision. Something that's 200 years or 150 years old, that's still with us and reminds us of another era, a way of being that was measured with these springs and bells. And, the Westminster tune, has imperial overtones. We talked about that, but it's still very beautiful and reminds us of, it probably reminds you of your culture, right? Of your upbringing.
Mm-hmm. And of course, it's visual in a way that keeping time digitally is not. When I look at a smartwatch, for example, it doesn't tell me anything. I mean, it tells me the time, but it doesn't tell me what the context is. When you look at a clock face, you see the whole 12 hours and where you are in that 12 hours. And so I find it much more, somehow puts you in context in a way that looking at a digital watch doesn't.
Well, let's end with what you're reading and listening to these days. What would you like to share?
Yeah, I think in terms of reading, I think of what Mary Oliver wrote in Instructions for Living a Life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. And that's what I look for, I think, in reading, whether it be fiction or nonfiction. You're looking for someone who's got a story that appeals to you for whatever reason, and has the ability to express it in language that touches you and helps you to understand what their vision of the world is. So for me, that translates into a lot of nonfiction. I can read almost any history, political biography, all of that I find fascinating. Particularly now, I'm looking at a lot of as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the anthropological research into how other cultures developed and why our Western so-called civilization became so predominant in the world. That to me is a fascinating tale because it's not something I really knew growing up, and it helps to explain a lot of the problems we're facing now. And in fiction, it's of course it's people with the imagination and creativity to bring another world to life. I mean, I think of people like Barbara Kingsolver or Dave Eggers or some of the other people. Hilary Mantel. I mean, there's so many. It's almost impossible to keep track. The ones I'm not interested in are the so-called beach reading or light stuff, the mystery novels. I mean, none of that really appeals to me that much. It just seems like there's so much really interesting stuff to read. I just can't imagine spending time on the stories that are just interesting stories, or not even interesting stories. They're just potboilers, but they draw you in because the tension or the drama. And of course, there's just so much now in the form of podcasts and commentary that adds a whole dimension to the news. My only worry is that it's so so voluminous. How on earth do you keep track of it? I mean, I'm constantly drawn into articles that appear on my screen from The Economist, which has an extraordinary capacity for choosing things that I think, I wonder about that. I mean, it's a little glimpse into an issue which I'm curious about, but I know I haven't got time to read. I mean, I did have a subscription to The Economist once. My entire week was consumed trying to get through before the next one arrived. So now I don't subscribe, but my curiosity is constantly piqued by these little aperçus that appear in your email and other things that you receive. So trying to manage the sheer volume of interesting material, and particularly it's a danger if you have a surfeit of intellectual curiosity, you can just become so superficially knowledgeable about so many things, but not actually have it come together, cohere in any sort of comprehensive understanding of what's really going on. It's just little anecdotes and little tastes of other people's interpretation of what's happening. So I think, it's good to have that curiosity, but at the same time you have to pull back and say, yeah, but I also need to understand the big picture and how these little pieces contribute to it.
Well, just this morning, I got an email from the Green Dreamer podcast, which I listen to a lot. Camilla Shane is the host, and they had a little roundtable of their staff, and they were talking about media consumption and overconsumption. And I haven't read it yet. I just got it this morning, but I bet it's about how do you find that balance?
Yeah.
Because it's so tempting. I love podcasts, when I'm cycling or doing the dishes, but my wife doesn't like it when I'm, immersed in audio world when I should be interacting with humans and more than humans and so on. So there is a question of curating your own digital and physical life. But when you like a story, I find that they tend to stay with me. There's certain stories and podcasts that just changed my life, but they substantially enriched an understanding. And I'm an audio person, but I also read. And so there's some books that sit on my shelf for years. I haven't read yet, but I will. I hope. If not, I'll pass them on. But I want them there because I want to honor the person who wrote it and say, I bought your book. And once in a while I'll flip in, and I'm sure you do that as well. You come in and out of literature, in and out of stories and anecdotes, and they enrich our lives, and they allow us, especially when we speak, we can also quote. I think that third part of the what you mentioned this morning, the sharing. What is the exact wording? Sharing.
Tell about it.
Tell about it.
Tell about it.
Tell about it. That's interesting as well, because just this morning you mentioned a number of things that you're reading and writing that you say, that's really interesting and difficult. And sometimes the difficulty is in and if you hear from somebody else and they tell you their version of a story, well, you sort of got it. You got it through that person's. But if it's somebody you trust, you say, well, hey, Tim, thanks for sharing that. Yeah. I don't have to read the book now. You've summarized it for me. And then vice versa. Anyway. I think I will leave it at that. Thank you so much, Tim Brodhead, for inviting me into your living room. And we'll talk again, I'm sure.
Thank you, Claude.